Camping had always been my escape, a way to disconnect from the hustle of daily life and immerse myself in nature. This time, I decided to go deeper into the forest than I ever had before, looking for a truly isolated spot. I packed my gear and set off early in the morning. The hike was invigorating, the dense forest offering a soothing symphony of rustling leaves and bird calls. By late afternoon, I found the perfect clearing surrounded by tall pines, far from any marked trails. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the solitude. As night fell, the forest transformed. The sounds of wildlife grew louder, more mysterious. The solitude that I had craved was beginning to feel a bit more unsettling. After a quick dinner, I decided to explore the area a bit before it got too dark. With my flashlight in hand, I ventured deeper into the woods. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows. I walked for about 20 minutes when I suddenly stumbled, my foot catching on something low to the ground. I caught myself just in time and shone my flashlight down to see what I had tripped over. A thin wire, almost invisible, was stretched across the ground at ankle height. My heart skipped a beat. I followed the wire with my flashlight and my blood ran cold. Just a few feet ahead, hidden under a layer of leaves and branches, were sharp wooden spikes, carefully positioned to cause maximum harm to anyone who tripped over the wire. Someone had set a trap. My mind raced. Who would do this? And why? I scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement, but the forest was still. A shiver ran down my spine. I carefully stepped over the wire and slowly backed away, my eyes darting around, hyper alert to any other potential dangers. As I retraced my steps, I found another wire and another, each one leading to a similar deadly trap. Panic began to set in. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to set these up, and I had no idea if they were still around, watching me. I decided it was too dangerous to stay out here any longer. I needed to get back to my campsite and leave immediately. I quickened my pace, making sure to step carefully to avoid any more hidden traps. When I finally reached my campsite, I quickly packed up my gear, my hands shaking. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim glow over the clearing. As I extinguished the fire, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was getting closer. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight and began to walk briskly towards the path I had come in on. The rustling continued, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. I kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees forming dark, imposing shapes in the night. Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension any longer, I stumbled onto the main trail. Relief washed over me, but I didn't stop. I kept walking, pushing myself to move faster. The rustling had stopped, but I wasn't taking any chances. I needed to put as much distance between myself and those traps as possible. When I finally emerged from the forest and reached my car, I practically threw my gear into the back seat and jumped in. I sat in the driver's seat, trying to calm my racing heart. And that's when I saw it. At the edge of the trees, an eerie figure stood watching me. It was tall and indistinct, a shadowy silhouette against the darkness. I stared, unable to move, as it slowly disappeared back into the trees. I drove away, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and didn't stop until I was far from that forest. The next day, I called the local authorities and explained everything. They agreed to investigate, and I led them back to the spot where I had set up camp. But when we got there, the tripwires were gone. The spikes, the traps, everything had disappeared without a trace. The officers looked skeptical, but they took my statement. I knew what I had seen, though, and the memory of that eerie figure still haunts me. I never went back to that forest. Some places are better left unexplored, their secrets hidden deep within the shadows. From that day on, I chose my camping spots much more carefully. Camping had always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. I loved the solitude, the peace, and the chance to disconnect from everything. This time, I decided to camp in an area I hadn't visited before, a remote part of the national forest known for its dense woods and lack of tourists. I packed my gear and set out early in the morning, excited for the adventure ahead. The drive took me deep into the heart of the forest, the road narrowing until it was little more than a dirt path. I parked my car at the end of the trail and hiked in for about an hour before finding a perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by tall, ancient trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what I hoped would be a peaceful weekend. As the sun began to set, I built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The night air was cool and refreshing, the sounds of the forest creating a soothing background. I was just beginning to relax when I heard a rustling noise nearby. I turned, expecting to see a deer or some other animal, but instead I saw a group of people standing at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. They didn't move or say anything, they just stared at me. There were 5 of them dressed in old, tattered clothes. Their eyes seemed to glow in the firelight and their faces were expressionless. I called out a greeting, trying to sound casual, but they didn't respond. They stood there for what felt like an eternity before suddenly turning and running back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I shrugged it off, thinking they were probably just other campers messing around or locals trying to scare me. Still, their silent, intense stares left me feeling uneasy. I told myself there was no reason to be scared and tried to enjoy the rest of the evening. After a while, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep, though I kept my flashlight and a pocket knife close by. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a scream. It was distant but unmistakable, a high-pitched, blood-curdling wail that echoed through the trees. My heart raced as I lay there, straining to hear any other sounds. The forest had gone eerily silent, and the only thing I could hear was my own breathing. I debated whether to investigate, but decided against it. Instead, I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal or maybe even the wind. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, though it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I awoke to find the fire had burned out. As I stepped out of my tent, I froze. Around my campsite, in a perfect circle, were small, carved wooden figures, each one resembling a human figure with exaggerated, haunting features. They hadn't been there the night before. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been here while I slept. The figures were creepy, their carved eyes seeming to follow me. I gathered them up and tossed them into the woods, telling myself it was just a prank by the same people who had stared at me the previous evening. I spent the day hiking and trying to shake off the unease. The forest was beautiful, but I couldn't fully enjoy it with the memory of those figures and the distant scream lingering in my mind. When I returned to my campsite, I was relieved to find everything as I'd left it. As night fell again, I built a fire and tried to relax. I kept telling myself there was nothing to worry about, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I kept my flashlight and knife close again, just in case. Around midnight, the rustling started again. This time it was closer, more deliberate. I turned and there they were, the same group of people standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. Their eyes glowed eerily in the firelight, and their expressions were just as blank as before. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "What do you want?" They didn't answer. Instead, they began to move. Not towards me, but around the clearing. Staying just within the shadows, they circled me, their movements slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest and I could feel the panic rising. Suddenly, one of them let out a scream. The same blood-curdling wail I'd heard the night before. The others joined in, their screams overlapping, creating a horrifying symphony of terror. I grabbed my flashlight and knife, standing up and backing towards my tent. As quickly as it had started, the screaming stopped. The figures stood still for a moment, then one by one they turned and ran into the woods, disappearing from sight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, every muscle tense, my eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. As I was about to leave, I noticed something on the ground near the fire. Another small wooden figure, this one carved in more detail. It looked like me, right down to the clothes I was wearing. I didn't touch it. I grabbed my backpack, threw it over my shoulder, and started the hike back to my car, glancing over my shoulder the entire way. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. When I finally reached my car, I got in as quickly as possible and drove away from there. I haven't told anyone about this experience I had. I'm afraid they'll believe I'm crazy, or even worse, they may want to go back to that forest I was camping in. I chose a remote spot deep within the sprawling Redwood National Park. The drive was long, winding through dense forests until the familiar sights of towering redwoods greeted me like ancient sentinels. I parked my car at the trailhead and shouldered my pack, eager to find the perfect camping spot away from the few marked trails. As I hiked deeper into the woods, the sounds of civilization faded behind me, replaced by the peaceful symphony of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon a secluded clearing nestled among the colossal trees. It felt like I had discovered a forgotten sanctuary. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and as dusk settled, I lit a small campfire. The crackling flames danced hypnotically, casting eerie shadows that flickered against the trees. As night fell, the forest took on a new character. The air grew colder and an unsettling silence enveloped the clearing. I told myself it was just the natural shift from day to night, but a knot of unease settled in my stomach. Ignoring my growing unease, I cooked a simple dinner and settled by the fire, trying to lose myself in the warmth and solitude. Hours passed. The fire burned low, and fatigue finally caught up with me. I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, the only barrier between me and the dark forest beyond. Sleep didn't come easily. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside made me tense. Sometime past midnight, I woke abruptly, a cold shiver running down my spine. There was a sound, a soft rhythmic tapping against the side of my tent. At first I thought it might be a branch swaying in the wind, but the tapping had a deliberate, almost methodical quality to it. Heart pounding, I listened intently, trying to identify the source. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. What I saw froze me in terror. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the darkness. It was tall and slender, with unnaturally long limbs. Its eyes gleamed in the faint moonlight, reflecting an eerie, otherworldly glow. The figure's head was tilted as if studying me with a predatory curiosity. I held my breath, paralyzed with fear. The figure took a step forward, and that's when I noticed something deeply unsettling. It wasn't walking. It moved with an unnatural grace, gliding silently across the forest floor, defying the laws of human movement. Panic surged through me. I scrambled back into the tent and zipped it shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The tapping continued, now louder and more urgent. I fumbled for my phone, intending to call for help, but there was no signal in the remote wilderness. Outside, the tapping abruptly stopped. Silence descended once more, thick and suffocating. I strained my ears, waiting for any sound, but there was nothing. Minutes stretched into hours as I lay there, wide awake, every nerve on edge. Just as I began to convince myself it had all been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion, I heard it, a low, guttural growl so close that it seemed to reverberate through the tent walls. Terror gripped me like a vice. Whatever was outside was no ordinary animal. I held my breath, trying to steady my racing heartbeat. The growl turned into a series of sharp, echoing barks, each one closer than the last. Then, without warning, it stopped altogether, replaced by an eerie silence that was even more unsettling. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed by fear. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I must have drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke with the first light of dawn, the forest was quiet and still, as if nothing had happened. I wasted no time packing up my gear, my hands shaking as I hurriedly dismantled the tent. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump, expecting the figure to appear again. Once everything was packed, I practically sprinted back to my car, never looking back. As I drove away from that isolated clearing, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't dare to stop until I reached the nearest town, where I finally felt safe enough to catch my breath. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. Some say it was a skinwalker, a malevolent spirit that takes on the appearance of animals or humans to stalk its prey. Others dismiss it as a trick of the mind, a product of an overactive imagination in the dark of night. But I know what I saw and heard. The fear and dread were real, etched into my memory like a scar. I haven't gone camping alone since that night, haunted by the knowledge that some things in the wilderness defy explanation, and that not all dangers come from the natural world.